Estamos iniciando nuestro segundo año de este seminario de Desigualdades, Movilidad Social y Equidad, un seminario que coordinamos entre el Departamento de Economía de la Ibero, el Equide, el Centro de Estudios Espinosa e Yglesias. El año pasado pues quedamos pues contentos con lo que logramos. Es un espacio para ir oxigenando nuestra discusión en torno a estos temas. E ir conociendo también el trabajo que está no solamente dándose en México, sino también en el mundo en general, ¿no? Entonces, pues vamos a arrancar este nuevo año y el día de hoy, nuestra invitada es una invitada de Luis Ángel y entonces le vamos a dar la palabra a Luis Ángel para que lleve la mesa. Entonces, bienvenidos a todos. Adelante, Luis.
So I'm going to switch to English so that Chiara understands us. Today we have the pleasure of having Chiara Malavasi as our speaker. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Mannheim and the CEEY, which is the Leibniz Center for European Economic Research. And she is dedicated to studying issues on labor, public, and health economics. And in particular, today she's going to present her research on the intergenerational returns to international migration, focusing on the case of the Italian immigrants across the world. She also has a master's in economics from the University of Pisa and the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies from Italy, and a bachelor in science in economics from the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luis. Let me share my screen and everything. Okay. Thank you, Luis, for inviting me, and thank you, all of you, for having me here. I'm very happy to start this year's series of seminars. And as Luis mentioned, yes, I'm gonna talk about the joint project with Guido Neidhofer, who's also a researcher at the DW in Mannheim, that looks at intergenerational returns to migration and particularly focuses on the case of Italian migrants around the world. And just to give you some very broad motivation on why should we care about this topic, well, what we're gonna do is to try and see how are children of Italian migrants performing around the world, with the idea that when their parents decided to migrate, they did not only wanted to improve their own opportunities, their own income, education, or employment opportunities, but maybe also search for better opportunities for their children in what economists might call intertemporal utility maximization thinking process. In this paper, we will focus, therefore, on the performance of migrants' children as part of looking at why migrants are taking the choice to migrate and are choosing different countries to migrate, and what are the consequences of this choice. So what are finally the performance of migrants' descendants around the world. And what we're gonna do is to compare the children of Italian migrants around the world, so in different countries worldwide, with the children of stayers. Or the ideal comparison would be the children of stayers, that is those that did not migrate and decided to stay in Italy and hence built up a family in Italy later on. What we're gonna do is to quantify intergenerational returns to migration, and in particular estimate the causal effect of migration by host country. The idea is to see how the decision to migrate in a country like Germany versus one like the US might have had a different impact on migrants' children performance. In doing so, we need to account for self-selection of parental generation at least. That is the idea that the parent generation is not a random sample of the original Italian population, but might be selected in terms of skills or abilities, and this might therefore transfer into the second generation. We will try to account for this and therefore estimate just the isolate the host country effect. And finally, we would like to propose an empirical testing for parental migration choices and whether they were really taking into account better opportunities for their children when taking the choice of which country to migrate. So even though this maybe is intuitive from anecdotal evidence or is something that we might expect, we still haven't seen, at least in the literature, some empirical testing for whether the individuals that take the decision to migrate are really considering or are this looking forward in terms of the things that they're considering when deciding to which country to migrate into. Just to give you a preview of our results, we will look at performance in terms of education, employment status, and predicted income. And what we find is that returns are strongly heterogeneous by destination country and gender. So children of Italian migrants in Germany are performing differently than children of Italian migrants in the US or in Brazil. And also, depending on whether this child is a female or a male child, they might have a different performance. We find in general that returns to education are not always positive. So maybe not surprisingly, the children of Italian migrants around the world do not necessarily study longer than their peers in Italy. But which is maybe good news for the Italian migrants, we do find that returns in terms of income and employment status are mostly positive. And in all the countries for which we have data. And finally, we do have some empirical evidence that their parents, so the individual took the decision to migrate, actually considered when deciding which country to migrate that they consider exactly also whether this specific country that they chose was also going to provide better opportunities for their children and their descendants, at least in monetary terms. Just very broadly, we relate to, of course, a number of papers, and this slide is for sure not exhaustive of all the papers that are out there and they look at performance of migrants around the world, but we would like to highlight these four main strands of the literature that we relate to. And in particular, we do relate somehow to the literature that looks at the integration of Italian migrants, of migrants in different destination countries. But we provide here some novel insights in the sense that we will focus instead of the comparison of migrants with stayers instead of natives into the destination country. But still our results could give some evidence on how good Italian migrants are integrating within the host country that they're currently living in. The second strand is that we more closely relate to, is the one that looks at the comparison of the first generation migrants with stayers, or that looks at the comparison of specifically second generation migrants with second generation stayers, so to speak. We provide here some novel evidence because we really would like to look at the causal effect of living in a specific host country and not just provide some descriptive statistics like so far has been done. And finally, we also, of course, broadly relate to the literature that looks at how migrant children are performing within countries, and this focuses instead on internal migration and shift and the consequences of changing neighborhoods or regions within a country on one's children and one's families. The data that we're using are called in Italian the Anagrafe degli Italiani residenti all'estero, which is very literally a register of Italians living abroad. This is a record that is maintained by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's very peculiar of the Italian case and very convenient for us. So Italians have to register into these records once they move abroad for more than 1 year, or if they're born abroad, or if they acquire citizenship while abroad, for instance, through marriage. And the registration is necessary if one wants to then register the marriage abroad, wants to pass the citizenship to their children, and wants to benefit from tax advantages, or better said, wants to avoid double taxation between Italy and the host country in which they're living in. Also, it's necessary for renewing one's passport at the local embassy or one's identification document at the local embassy. Our data include about 80% of Italian registered to CEEY in 2015 in about 13 different countries worldwide. I will give you the list in a few slides, but we have both North America and Latin America, many countries in Europe and Australia. We integrate with this data set with two more data sources. The first one is the survey on household income and wealth, which is provided by the Bank of Italy, and it's a representative survey of the Italian population in Italy. And we need this to compare the migrants' outcome with their peers in Italy. So people that are born in the same year and also come from the same Italian region as the as the migrants. And then furthermore, we use an additional data source, which is the Luxembourg income study. It's an harmonized cross-country household survey. And we use this to estimate migrants' income in the destination country. This is because one unfortunate limitation of our records of Italian migrants around the world, they do include the level of education and occupation, employment status of the migrants, but they do not have any information on income. So we use this information included in the IRA records together with the information from the Luxembourg income study to predict income into the destination country based indeed on education, employment status, gender, age, and other observables. Our baseline sample is made of second-generation migrants, and how we define them is as anybody that is born, any Italian that is born abroad or migrated before age 18 from at least one parent born in Italy. We will do robustness checks on these cutoffs, and our results are robust to that, but this is our, let's say, baseline specification. And of course, they must be living abroad in 2015, and this is because we only have access to the records of Italian living abroad for 2015. So what we will unfortunately miss here would be anybody, any family that came back to Italy before this date. So migrated, let's say in 1990, and then decided to go back to Italy in 2010, well, we would not see them in the data. In addition, we look, add the Italian residents of Italy in 2014 from the survey of household income and wealth from the Bank of Italy. We use 2014 because this is a biannual survey, so we don't have exactly 2015 data. But here you will see that, I mean, we have robustness checks on this and our results don't change. And we also, and we restrict it to anybody, both second-generation migrants and residents of Italy that are born between 1960 and 1980. This is so that they are below 55 in 2015, so they are still surely part or likely part of the workforce, and also they most likely have completed their education fully by 2015. In our data on migrants, as I was previewing you before, contain information on education and employment, not only for second-generation migrants, but also for their parents. And the same information we have for the residents of Italy in 2014. And then we use the Luxembourg income study to have a prediction of income by destination country. And as I was also mentioning a few slides ago, our second-generation migrants live in different countries around the world. We have information for Latin America, on Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil, a variety of European countries, US and Canada, and also Australia. Let me know if there is any question. Of course, I'm happy to answer them also on the go. So our baseline empirical strategy would be to estimate, so in a perfect world in which observables would take fully into account self-selection of parental generation, we would estimate the equation in this slide. Regress either the level of education, occupation, or the predicted income on the host country fixed effect, so a country of residence, the country of residence fixed effect, which would capture the country-specific effect on second-generation migrant performance. And we would control for additional parental characteristics that would take into account selection on observables. And in particular, what we can do here is to control for educational category of the parents and Italian region of origin, which for the specific case of Italy, it's an important control to at least take into account different cultures within the same country, especially when you consider, as maybe many of you know, the strong differences there are between North, Center, and South of Italy. And then finally, we would control for individual characteristics such as gender and age of the second-generation migrant to take also these differences into account. And if there were no selection on observables, then the alpha-1 coefficient in these slides would be an unbiased estimate of the causal effect of migrating into Germany versus the US on level of education, occupational status, or predicted income of the migrants' children. However, if there are some unobservable characteristics that are determining the selection in the parental generation, this would bias the OLS estimate also in our previous slides. especially if, let's say, these unobservable characteristics are related to skills that are transmitted to the second generation, and this difference in skill cannot be captured by controlling for the level of education or Italian or region of origin of the parents. And so what we do here to tackle this issue is to adopt a two-step self-selection bias correction model. This is very much in the spirit of an Ekman kind of model, but instead of only considering selection into the migration choice, we consider selection into the choice of which country to migrate in. And so in the first step, we estimate the probability of migrating into each destination country via a multinomial logic model, in which we include push and pull factors as excluded variables. And then we take the predicted probabilities from the multinomial logic model and include them as a control in our main regression of interest, so the one that you saw in the previous slides, to hopefully take self-selection of unobservables into account and make sure that it doesn't bias our host country fixed effect coefficients. So more specifically, what we're going to do in the first step is to estimate the equation on this slide. So the probability of migrating into each different destination countries regressed on the same variables that you saw before, so parental characteristics and age and gender of the second generation. And in addition, a set of variables related to the migration choice. And in particular, we consider push and pull factors that, and we take some variables that are related to the existing migration literature to proxy for that. On the one hand, we consider a proxy for the cohort size, so the number of migrants in the same cohort of the individual I parents and coming from the same Italian region of origin as I's parents that decided to migrate outside of the region, independently of whether of which country they decided to migrate into. And as proxy for pull factor, we consider an interaction of the Gini coefficient index in the destination country at birth of the individual with parental education. And this is mainly to capture the idea that higher skilled individuals are attracted to more unequal countries, usually more attracted to more unequal countries, and lower skilled individuals, on the other hand, are attracted to more equal countries. So the welfare magnet hypothesis idea that is present in the literature. And then the second step is basically the same equation that you saw a couple of slides ago, but with the inclusion of this additional bias correction term, which is a function of the predicted probabilities of migrating in the chosen countries that we estimated in the first step. And on the other controls stay the same. And what we are interested in is exactly the beta 1 coefficient here. And this is also what I will show you in the results I will show you from now onwards, basically, the coefficients for which I will show you results. So how well does this perform, or what happens when we use these different selection controls? Here we look at the likelihood of completing tertiary education for the second generation migrant. So on the x-axis you have percentage points, and on the y-axis is the beta 1 coefficient for the different destination country. The baseline for specification does not control, so the base specification, the blue diamond, does not control for any type of selection, so not even for parental education or Italian region of origin. The red triangle adds these two controls, but does not add the bias correction term. And finally, the green circles do include the bias correction term as well. And what you can see here is that, at least for our specific case, once we include controls for selection on observables in the parental generation, it seems that we're taking already into account most of the selection that is going on here, or at least the selection that is somehow transmitted from the first to the second generation. And now if we can, let's focus now on the main results. So from now on, I will only show you the coefficients estimated once the bias correction polynomial is included. But keep in mind that for basically all the results that I'm showing you, not including it does not make a big difference in terms of controlling for self-selection. So here, again, this is still the likelihood of completing tertiary education. It's the same plot as before, just to focus a bit more on the results. we see here that there are strongly heterogeneous returns by destination country in terms of how likely it is that the second generation migrants completes tertiary education. And this is how we think of this, is that as fully reflecting host country characteristics, including most likely in this case, school system characteristics, right? So in not all countries, children of Italian migrants are studying longer than their peers in Italy. But if you want to find a pattern, what you can see, if you want to find a pattern, what we can see is that mostly they study somewhat less years, somewhat less or for a shorter amount of time in European countries, and somewhat longer amount of time in extra-European countries. And here really, we think of it as differences in school systems. So if you look, for instance, of the coefficient for Germany, which at least for us is one of the cases we're more familiar with, in comparison to Italy, the German system is incentivizing or at least promoting a lot more vocational training. So for our data, this would mean that the individual did not complete the tertiary education degree, but not because they have less opportunity later on, as we will also see with our other variables, but simply because maybe they undertook a vocational training. Tough. And indeed, once we look at returns in terms of likelihood of being employed, we do see that returns are mostly positive in any of the destination country we can observe for both men and women. And actually, female second-generation migrants are even gaining even more from the migration choice in terms of how likely they are to participate into the labor force and being unemployed. And when we finally look at predicted disposable income, so you should think of this as a summarizing measure of both the education and employment status that you saw before, gender and age differences. And here what we are predicting is equalized household disposable income. So we think of this as a proxy for the living standards of second-generation migrants around the world. And what we observe here is that with the only exception of Brazil, second-generation migrants are earning more per year in comparison to their Italian peers. And this is expressed in $10,000 per year in purchasing power parity, so you can compare these numbers across countries. And again, this is really capture host-country differences, right? So this likely also capture differences, or at least better, does not fully disentangle from differences in welfare state. So it's true that, for instance, children of Italian migrants in the US seem to be perceiving a substantially higher income than their peers in Italy, but also than the children of Italian migrants in France or Germany. But at the same time, they're more likely to pay out of pocket for things like private health insurance or school or college, things like that, right? So these estimates do not take this into account, so do not fully, let's say, rule this out, but take into account, but allow us to fully see these differences, net of the self-selection and net of the second-generation migrant characteristics, observable characteristics. We have a variety of other results that I'm happy to discuss more in depth later on. If you're interested, we estimate returns in terms of hourly earnings. So we also look at how the children of Italian migrants are doing in comparison to natives. So when looking at the position in the host country income distribution. And we do see that actually in this specifics, for this specific case, they often do not gain positions in terms of host country income distribution, even though they are performing better than their Italian peers. We also try to use different populations to predict income. If you're worried, for instance, that the children of Italian migrants might not, so our predictions might be somewhat upwardly biased because we are using information on the full population for each host country to predict income. We also try to look at only natives in those countries versus migrants in those countries to produce our income estimates, and results don't change. We interestingly explore heterogeneity by age at migration. So depending on whether they migrated before they were born or during their primary school years or later than that. Or explore heterogeneity by parental level of education. This is the best proxy we have for their socioeconomic status, as well as looking at heterogeneity by number of Italian parents. And we run a number of robustness checks. So what we see is that our results are robust to using a broader sample that is available in our data, but for whom we cannot observe parents, as well as only considering individuals in our data that are not only born outside Italy, but are born in the country they're currently living in. We also change slightly the comparison sample to see if this might make a difference, and use different waves of the survey of household income and wealth, as well as different waves of the Luxembourg income study to predict income, and adopt a different specification of the bias correction term when controlling for self-selection, as well as trying to think of alternative strategy for accounting for this self-selection bias in the first generation. And our results don't change, or at least don't change much. The sign is the same, and they go in the same direction. But I would like to use maybe the last 5-10 minutes. I hope, yes, it should. I hope it's still fine. To talk about the last thing that we do in our analysis, which is to test whether expected chances for children are really affecting parental migration choices. So whether parents were really somehow thinking of better opportunities for their children when choosing in which country to migrate into, rather than only trying to maximize their own opportunities. And to do that, we estimate an alternative specific conditional logic model, a McFadden, in which we look at whether predicted income of the firstborn child or predicted income of parents is predictive of the final destination country chosen by the migrants, controlling for characteristics like birth year, migration age, but also Italian region of origin, and gender of the children. And this is our results that we think are pretty interesting. So in the first column, we look at our full sample, so all families, and we look at whether so the first child and parents' income, an average of the parents' income is predictive of the likelihood of choosing a specific country to migrate into. And we see that both of them are positively and significantly correlated with the choice of destination country. But if we split between families in which the first child was born after or before the migration happened, we do observe that for children born after the migration happened, only parental income is predicted parental income is relevant in the choice of which country to migrate into. And when we look at families when the first child was already born before the migration took place, only the first child income is relevant in deciding which country to migrate into. So this is really, we really look at this as empirical evidence that the parents were somehow considering better opportunities for their children, of course, only if the children were already born, or at the very least, maybe more broadly, if they were planning. One could also extend this to whether they were already planning to have children or already planning to have a family, maybe migrated as a couple and so on. But not if the child was born after migration or after the migration choice was taken. And what is also interesting is that we can look at this depending on the level of parental education. So we can do a similar type of heterogeneity analysis. And we do see that this effect is particularly, we see it again only for when the parental education is above compulsory education, which is what we define here as high, which somehow we think it makes sense. Because of course, lower educated parents are more likely to have a lower wage, a lower income, and therefore do need to take also their own income into account in order to make sure to ensure some minimum level of living standards also to their children. Whereas higher educated parents, it's even that they might be willing to forego some part of their income in lieu of an additional gains for their firstborn children. And to interpret these results even more, what we're trying to do, this is maybe the most preliminary part of this project, so still work in progress, but what we're trying to do is to think about simulations that we can do with these results, with this data, so with the equation that I showed you before, to try and see how important, what's the relative importance of firstborn child income versus parental income, and what's really, how important the two elements are. And what we think here of is as a very simple and basic college expansion policy in the US, in which in a very, of course, abstract word, we think that the migrants, when they took, or the individual that decides to migrate, when taking the decision to migrate, knows that now in the US, if they decide to go there, in the moment they will cross the border, they will be asked to forgo 20% of their income in the country in order for their children to access free college. And this 20% of their income will be then imply an increase of 20% of income by their children if they decide to attend college, because this is what, I mean, this is what in the literature related to the Mincer equation, the estimates predict in terms of increase in earnings that one can have if they complete a bachelor degree. So the most simple, let's say, type of framework you can think. And here, the blue line is the likelihood of migrating to the US depending on parental income without this policy. So what we estimate in our data. And we do see that individuals with higher income are more likely to decide to migrate toward the US versus individuals with lower income. And then the red line is what happens to these probabilities, so the estimated probabilities of migrating to the US once we implement, let's say, this policy or this shift of 20% of income from parents to their firstborn child. And we see that there is an upward shift of the probabilities for all income groups, but there's also a change in the slope, so that not only everybody is more likely to go to decide to go to the US now, but especially higher income individuals are even more likely to decide to go to the US. And the green line is exactly the difference between the blue and the red one, and will show you this shift, but not only in terms of intercept, but also of slope. So to sum up, we quantify intergenerational returns to migration, and after accounting for parental self-selection, we find that strongly heterogeneous returns by destination country and gender. We find that returns in terms of education are not always positive, but we do see that children of Italian migrants around the world are more like have a higher income than their peers in Italy, and are also more likely to be employed in the destination country. And we do provide empirical evidence that the expectation for better opportunity for their offspring is something that actually impacts parental migration choices. And that was it. Thank you so much for the attention, and I'm happy to take any questions, curiosity, or talk a bit more about our results. And of course, you can always reach out to me later on as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. So I'm opening the floor for questions. I'll start with the people at Ibero. So if you have any question, please go ahead.
Hi, Ciara. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Hi.
It's a really, really interesting topic, and I think it's ambitious, I have to say, but I think it shows the potential of combining very different sources of information. However, using so many sources of information is also challenging, you know, in terms that you have to make a lot of adjustments in econometry methods. And so the first question is very, very technical. How did you impute income, and how did you address the variation in the income imputation into your estimates? Because you show I think the standard errors is only the standard errors of the final model, but you have a lot of variation into the income estimation, so that you should adjust your standard errors. So I don't know how you address that. The other thing is that, I mean, I think maybe you have heard about this before, But I think your strategy only marginally addresses the problem of a lot of unobservables, and very important unobservables in terms of migration, specifically, for example, motivation or availability of contacts in the hosting country, which, I mean, they are very important in terms of the outcomes that the people can have in the hosting country. But I don't know if it is possible to try to address in a more complete way this element. Again, of course, I think you have restrictions because of the data, but I mean, the sample of countries is very limited and biased to the European Union. So I don't know if this is, I mean, how this affects the generality of your conclusions. Because I mean, there's only 2 Latin American countries, and I think, three Latin American countries, and they have very different results. So I don't know if you really want to have some kind of causal interpretation of your results, you will need a more heterogeneous sample. Because anyway, if you have most of the people going to only a few countries in the area that you have a specific agreement in order to have workers received in the country with good conditions, I don't know how this would compare to other countries where the conditions are completely different. Finally, because just in terms of recommendations, I would recommend maybe complementing this investigation with some qualitative analysis, maybe trying to make some interviews with actual people that had gone to at least 1 or 2 of these countries in order to understand why they did it, how they did it, why they are having this kind of outcomes. Or maybe you can complement the analysis with other surveys that has data on the characteristics of migration. For example, in the Science Society study in the UK household longitudinal study, and they have information both they have a subsample specific for ethnic minorities and migrations, and maybe you can find, I mean, maybe there's not a lot of sample, but at least you have questions about the first gen, the second gen, which have more characteristics than the ones that you're including, because now you're including only the age, education, and I don't know, maybe it's a very, very limited set. So, well, I think that's everything, and thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you. No, thank you for your questions and comments. So on the income prediction, what we do is that we, in the Luxembourg income study, which is the set of surveys representative of each destination country, we regress their measure of equalized disposable income for each individual in the survey for each different destination country on educational category, employment status, gender, and age. And we take the estimated coefficients from the Luxembourg income study and reapply them to our data. So it's fully a prediction. What we don't do, and actually that's a very good idea, something we could implement, is to provide a range for its prediction, because of course we could use the standard errors from the equation in the Luxembourg income study to provide a range. We focus more on looking for the right population, let's say, within the survey data, in order to get the most precise estimate that we can get, or the most reliable estimate that we can get for Italian migrants abroad, right? Which are a very different population from natives in Germany or migrants in Germany. But this is a distinction we can do. For some countries, we can identify specifically the population of children of Italians abroad or the population of Italians abroad. So we do robustness checks for this, and this our results don't change. But we can look more into the range. That's definitely possible. I mean, on the selection part, absolutely, I take the point that there are many variables that could not be included. Some variables that are not included here that could be relevant for the migration choice. I think what's maybe somehow missing here is mostly related to the network effect. because of course, so the let's say size of the migration cohort should capture for things that somehow push you outside of your area or original area, that are in the sense that a higher number of people that move out from that area would be an element that should capture this part. But of course, we don't include the size of the network in the destination country, which we could include. We're a bit worried this might raise some other indigeneity issue, to be honest. Yeah, but I take the point that this is not all the things that, let's say, lead the migrants to decide whether to migrate and where to migrate. They say the important thing for this strategy is that they capture a good part of why this happened and of these, let's say, components, and that they are not exogenous for our strategy to work. But I take the point that, of course, there are so many different, let's say, aspects to the migration choice that it's hard, and I mean, it's not so easy to include them all, of course. On qualitative analysis, yeah, that's a very qualitative analysis and survey analysis. Yeah, that's a very good point. We didn't do it so far, but it's true that we could collect some evidence, at least for some countries, and definitely. I'm not sure about interviewing people because we don't have, I mean, we could interview people, but then we cannot link it with the data, but we could get some additional analysis in that sense and as a separate analysis, let's say, and definitely use some survey data questions. So thanks a lot for that. And we will think about how to include this in our, in the paper. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions among the people that are connected online? The Zoom call.
Isidro.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Chiara, for your presentation. I just wonder how comparable are the incomes figures that you found, in a sense that the quality of living will be very different in Venezuela than in Argentina, for example, or in just that. Although it is adjusted by the purchasing power, but the quality of life could be very different.
Yes. Is that your only question, or
yes, that's my only question.
Okay. Yeah, no. So totally, we can control. So indeed, this is purchasing power parity. But it's absolutely true that the living standards in these countries are very different, right? So we're not saying that the living standards in one country are better, or these individuals are living for surely better in one country or the other because we estimate that they are their income is higher. But for sure, at least for some of the countries here, income would be at least this is, I mean, this is equivalized disposable income, household equivalized disposable income. So for sure, income can be a good proxy for that, but it's not perfect, and even purchasing power parity cannot fully account for difference in quality of life in these different countries. This is absolutely true.
Thanks.
Rodolfo? You're muted, Rodolfo.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Two questions. Your results show that well, the results of a second generation depend on the characteristic of their fathers and mothers. So I don't know if you can relate this kind of strategy to the measurement of inequality of opportunity. If there is some kind of inequality of opportunity measurement in your regressions. The second question is about positional mobility. You mentioned that there were changes in the position and the distribution of origin and the destination countries. I don't know if you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So on inequality of opportunity, we don't have specifically a measure that looks at social mobility. What we do have, and I can show you, is that some heterogeneity by parental education, which maybe goes a bit into your direction. So these are the results on predicted disposable income, distinguishing between low and high education parents, that is where we consider low if they completed at most compulsory education. So we do see some evidence here for upward mobility in the sense that we see that returns are even more, even stronger for children that grew up in lower education families or families in which the parents didn't reach, none of the parents reached a compulsory education level, which are likely to be also poorer families in general, but we don't have specifically a measure that looks at social mobility. And then your second question was related to the income distribution. So what we also did is instead of having just an absolute value for predicted income, we try to predict through the Luxembourg income study the position, the percentile of belonging to the income distribution in the destination country, to try to see whether not only the children of migrants are earning more than their peers in Italy, but are also gaining in, let's say, positions in the income distribution. So also, let's say, in comparison to the natives. So if you look at the baseline one, so the green triangles, so we mostly do not see that they gain positions except for Brazil or Australia. They actually lose some positions here, at least if you believe this way of estimating this. I hope this answers your question.
Araceli?
Thank you. Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I am here with my prayer. Hi. I really enjoyed your paper. I arrived a little bit late, and maybe the questions I couldn't hear if you are taking in account the time the people has been in the country they migrate, like the residents. Because if they, at the time of the survey, they have spent more years in the country of residence, probably they have a higher income and a better position. And the age of the child of migration, because it seems, as Chetty says, if they migrate younger, they will have a higher impact, no, in their social mobility. And also, if the reason of migrating, although Victor asked already, is because the mother or the father had a job promise in the country. So just in this gender issue, whether it was a woman who led the migration or it was the man who led the migration. And I really enjoyed the paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the time of residence, so your first point, I guess, was related to the parents. We did, so we have some specification in which we control for the year of arrival, the year of registration into our data, and results don't change, but we don't do much more about this. So we don't do heterogeneity by length of time the parents were in the country, but we could explore this actually. Thank you for mentioning this. But what we do is really in the spirit of Chetty or Alesina's paper, look at heterogeneity by children's age of migration. And this is basically this plot. So we want to see if children that migrated later on have more similar performance to their Italian peers in comparison to the other second generation migrants. And this is kind of what we see here. So the year age of migration refers to the second generation person. The Italian dotted line would be the disposable income they would we would predict for them to have in Italy, for their peers to have in Italy. And here you see how also their predicted disposable income goes closer to the one of their Italian peers the older they are. So in the baseline estimate, we include anybody that migrated before age 18. But here we try to explore this dimension as well. So our results do go in the direction that the later migration implies, let's say, lower returns in our case. We don't have information on the reason to migrate, unfortunately, but we can explore. So what we could do is and we also don't know who initiated the migration. That's also the other thing. What we can do is to explore heterogeneity depending on whether, if they have only one Italian parent, whether this parent is a man or a woman, so the Italian parent. I'm not sure if we have the sample, we have enough sample size to do that, but we can definitely explore this and see if this has a different impact on the returns. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Rocio?
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation, Chiara. Just a question is about the anagrafe, because as well as my understanding, it's not compulsory to be registered in the anagrafe Italiano, because it's quite perversive to be registered for the Italians in this institution. So I don't know how biased could be your data for that.
Yeah, definitely. It's true. So the registration is mandatory, but there is no penalty for not registering. And unfortunately, of course, we don't have data for those that are not registered, right? Because this is our main data source. So there are a few things here. So registration is not so there is no penalty for not registering. But if anybody that is not included in these records would have a hard time to build up a family abroad, because they could not, for instance, register their marriage, they could not pass their citizenship to their children or renew Italian passport abroad, and they would be double taxed as well. Of course, then there is the issue of fiscal evasion, which is maybe it's related but different issue. But there are a number of things that are at least harder for you to do if you live abroad, especially, if you live in Switzerland, maybe you go back to Italy, right, to do these kind of things. But if you live in Argentina or Brazil, it's not as easy to fly back to Italy just to renew your passport or do any of this. So our data are definitely not representative of any temporary migration, like students or very younger people or people that stay abroad for just a few years, or they don't move the family abroad, things like that. But we do believe are a good proxy of the population of Italians abroad that plans to build up a family abroad and to have long-term, to stay long-term abroad. And on the other hand, even though we only have limited data on to back this up, we do have some representative surveys for some countries that include information on the population of Italian migrants in that country. So my co-author has a paper with this data in which he looks at Germany, and he compares the figures that we can estimate in terms of education distribution of an age distribution from our data to that of the SOIP, which is a representative survey on the German population. And they include the information on the population of Italians in Germany. And so the figures that we estimate are similar to that in this survey. We could do this for a few more countries, not everyone for data limitations, but at least the evidence that we have is that for long-term migration, our data should be enough, at least to have a representative, let's say, sample of the population. I hope this answered your question.
Okay, so since I do not see any other hand raised, I'll take my chance to ask a couple of questions. So I wanted to know if you have looked at the descriptive evidence of who is migrating to Brazil, because I think it shows a clear like when you analyze the positional mobility and contrast it with the absolute mobility results that you get, you find like the people who migrate to Brazil might be trading off positional mobility for loss in absolute terms. In the sense that they are the only ones who seem to be gaining positions in the ranks, while they are the only ones who are losing absolute income. So I was wondering, like, just what is the profile of the Italian migrants in Brazil? Because they seem to be, at least from this type of evidence, that they have like a more positional, they are more positionally concerned than the other ones that kind of go along with the theory or the mainstream theory about why people migrate. And the other one is if you could talk a bit more about your results by heterogeneity by the number of Italian parents, because I'm really curious to see like if there is an effect depending on, well, when do you get your partner, and if the partner comes from the host country, or if you arrive with a partner from Italy.
Yes, so on the evidence from Brazil, so from descriptive evidence, we do see that, so now I don't have a table here by country. So I don't think we see a particularly different like age or gender pattern, but it's somehow different in terms of education in Latin America. So they usually study somewhat longer, and as you said, so and you see in the results, finally they also usually belong to somewhat higher positions in the distribution of the destination country, even though they have then less income in absolute terms. So we don't have a particularly good explanation on why this happens. One concern that we have is, even though one concern that we have is that we can see we can see that these individuals are second generation migrants because we see that they are born in the destination country, and we see that their parents are born in Italy. But we cannot be 100% sure that they are not longer time descendants of Italians that migrated to Brazil, because Italy has ius sanguinis, so anybody that has an Italian ancestor can claim Italian citizenship, and this is less relevant for European countries, but might be more relevant for Latin American country, the possibility to get an Italian passport, right? And this we see in the first generation descriptive. So we have, so for instance, Argentina is our top destination in absolute terms, but also the embassies tell us that this is something we need to be careful about. We're less concerned about this for the second generation migrants, because we do impose a series of restrictions, right? It's a very specific case, the one that we would need to have in order for our data to be substantially biased by this let's say phenomenon. But it's still possible. So this is something we cannot fully take this into account. And then on the heterogeneity by number of Italian parents. On the one hand, I can tell you that our results are very similar, independently of whether you have one or two Italian parents. But on the other hand, maybe somewhat disappointing, we cannot, we don't know which citizenship the non-Italian parent has. So it could be the local one, but it could also be another one. And this, unfortunately, we don't have in our data. So on the one hand, if you have one or two Italian parents, it seems to matter marginally in terms of predicted disposable income, but also the other variables I showed you seems to make, some difference, but not a lot, and not in all countries. On the other hand, we cannot be sure that, so this let's say, estimates are from a household where the couple is one Italian and one, let's say, from the UK in UK, or from Germany in Germany, and so on. So this is, data limitation, unfortunately.
Thank you, Chiara. Is there any other question at the Ibero?
cannot hear.
We cannot hear you guys.
No,
Ninguna.
Any other question among the people on the Zoom call? No, I'm not seeing any questions on Twitter, and I don't know if we are receiving questions in the YouTube chat. But if not, then thank you, Chiara, for a very nice and dynamic presentation. I'll cede the floor to the people at Ibero, who I think want to speak a bit more with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Isidro?
Ok. Bueno, si quieren, nada más vamos a cerrar primero la transmisión. Pues muchísimas gracias a todos por su presencia. Estamos muy emocionados de seguir con este seminario que yo creo que va a tener varias sesiones a lo largo del año, así que estén atentos a nuestras redes sociales, tanto la del CEEY como las del Equide y todos nuestros colegas del CEEY. Y por supuesto, los invitamos a las siguientes, van a estar muy emocionantes, las trataremos de presentar a lo largo del año. Y ya nada más para cerrar, pues de nuevo, pues, muchas gracias a todos.